July 27th, 1214, a single day that would decide the fate of kings, crush empires, and redraw the future of Europe forever. The sun had barely risen over the fields near the quiet village of Bouvines when the ground began to tremble, not from thunder, not from storm, but from the marching of thousands of armored men. Steel clashed against steel, banners snapped violently in the wind, and somewhere in the distance a horn echoed, a signal that history was about to be written in blood. At the center of it all stood one man, Philip II of France, a king underestimated by many, but feared by those who knew his ambition. Facing him was a powerful coalition, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, allied with King John of England and rebellious French nobles. This was no ordinary battle. This was a clash of empires, and what happened that day would change everything. For years before this fateful encounter, Europe had been simmering with tension. Philip II of France had been slowly but relentlessly expanding his power, taking lands that once belonged to the English crown. Normandy, Anjou, and other territories had slipped from the grip of King John of England like sand through his fingers. John was furious, humiliated, desperate. He needed revenge. So he did what kings often do when cornered. He built alliances. He turned to the Holy Roman Empire, convincing Otto IV to join forces. Together with Flemish and German troops, they formed a massive coalition aimed at crushing France once and for all. Their plan was simple, yet deadly. John would attack from the south, while Otto and his allies would strike from the north. France would be caught in a deadly pincer, trapped, surrounded, and destroyed. It was a perfect strategy. But war is never perfect. For while John launched his campaign in the south, Philip moved quickly. He understood the danger of being surrounded. He couldn't afford to split his forces, so he made a bold decision: ignore John and strike north with full force. It was a gamble. If he failed, France would fall. But if he succeeded, he would become unstoppable. As Philip marched north, his army grew. Knights, infantry, and militia rallied under his banner. Among them were loyal nobles, hardened veterans, and even ordinary men willing to fight for their king. Meanwhile, the coalition forces gathered near Bouvines. Their numbers were impressive, even superior. German knights in shining armor, Flemish infantry, and seasoned warriors stood ready. At their center stood Emperor Otto IV, confident and determined. This was supposed to be his victory. July 27th, 1214, the two armies finally faced each other. The air was thick with tension. Horses snorted, armor creaked, men whispered prayers under their breath. Then the battle began. At first it was chaos. The clash of cavalry thundered across the field. French knights charged with ferocity, smashing into enemy lines. The ground shook as armored horses collided, throwing men into the mud. On one flank, the Flemish forces pushed hard, threatening to break the French line. For a moment, it seemed like the coalition might overpower them, but Philip's army held, barely. Then came a moment that nearly changed everything. King Philip himself was targeted. Enemy forces surged toward him, aiming to kill or capture the French king. In the chaos, Philip was unhorsed, thrown to the ground, vulnerable. For a split second,
France stood on the edge of disaster. But his knights reacted instantly. They formed a shield around him, fighting desperately, pushing back the attackers. Philip was lifted back onto a horse, battered but alive. The king had survived, and that moment ignited something within his army. With renewed fury, the French forces counterattacked. On the right flank, they began to push back the Flemish troops. On the left, they clashed fiercely with German knights. The battlefield turned into a storm of steel, screams, and blood. At the center, Emperor Otto IV led his forces forward, determined to break the French line himself. It was a gamble and a mistake. As Otto advanced, he exposed his position. French knights saw their chance. They charged, hard, relentless. The emperor's forces began to crumble under the pressure. Horses fell, banners collapsed, and confusion spread like wildfire. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, Otto IV fled the battlefield. The sight of his emperor retreating shattered the morale of his army. Panic spread. What had once been a powerful coalition now turned into a disorganized retreat. Soldiers dropped their weapons, fleeing for their lives. Commanders tried to regroup, but it was too late. The battle was lost. Meanwhile, many of the coalition's key leaders were captured. Among them were powerful nobles whose defeat would weaken resistance against Philip for years to come. The battlefield fell silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the distant cries of the defeated. The Battle of Bouvines was over, but its consequences were just beginning. For Philip II of France, this victory was more than just a military success. It was a turning point. His power was now unquestioned. France emerged stronger, more unified, and more dominant than ever before. His enemies had been crushed, his authority secured, and his legacy immortalized. For King John of England, the defeat was catastrophic, even though he wasn't present at Bouvines himself. His failed campaign and the collapse of his allies weakened him politically back home. His barons lost faith, his authority crumbled, and within a year, he would be forced to sign one of the most important documents in history, the Magna Carta, a document that would limit the power of kings forever. As for Otto IV, his defeat marked the end of his reign. Abandoned and discredited, he would soon lose his title, fading into history as a failed emperor. The Battle of Bouvines didn't just decide a war, it reshaped Europe. It strengthened France, weakened England, and altered the balance of power across the continent. But beyond kings and politics, there's something deeper. A single day, a single battle, a single moment where everything could have gone differently. If Philip had fallen, if Otto had held his ground, if the lines had broken just a little earlier, history itself might have changed. Instead, on that summer day in 1214, in a field near a small village called Bouvines, one king stood victorious, and the world would never be the same again.